Good? Whoa, there it is. Got me. All right, we are going to start our discussion of the kings. We're going to do all of them. We'll do all of them quickly. Tonight we're going to go through 23 chapters, so I hope you're ready. It's like a minute a chapter. I think I can do that. Piece of cake. Let me catch you up kind of where we are in the story. So you get creation. We go through Genesis. We end up in in Egypt. All right? In Egypt, we come out of that. We go directly into the wilderness. God's plan was, hey, go right into Canaan. The people did not trust God, did not go into Canaan. And so they turned around and said, look, you're going to wander for 40 years. All right? So they wander for 40 years. All right? We get the book of Deuteronomy, which I call the pep rally. All right? Deuteronomy is the pep rally. It's on one side of the Jordan. It's all in one day. If you read through Deuteronomy, you see the word today, 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 today mentioned over and over. Why? Because it was all done in one day. It was just one day. It's like that's why I call it the pep rally. All right? So we go into there. Joshua begins this conquest. All right? So we just start wiping people out, starting with Jericho. We get to Ai. We get to Bethel. We get to all of these things. We're just wiping out all the ites, all right, the Perizzites and the Hittites and the Ammonites and the Amorites and all the ites, all right. We get to the end of Joshua. Joshua dies off. Judges starts, and Judges starts with this horrible omen verse. It says, and the people after Joshua's generation did not know what the Lord had done. And how do you get that? How do you get to that point? After all that he has done, all the plagues, all of this, and now this generation grows up and they don't know what God has done. So we start this 400 years, what we call the Judges cycle, okay? And it's basically, we did what was evil, God sent an ite or a steens, all right? And they oppress us. We cry out in our oppression. God sends a judge, all right, which is a political, military type leader who comes in, rescues us from the steens or the ites. All right, then everything's good and everything's calm again, you know, like what right after 9/11, everybody, now we're 20 years later, we've got comfortable, shall we say? And then God sends another group to oppress us. And so this cycle runs for about 400 years, the last of them being Samuel. All right, so Samuel is kind of the last of the judges, all right, if we can call him that, all right? So in chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, if you want to head there with me. See, that was fast, right? I just did 7 chapters of 7 books of the Bible in 4 minutes. So that was easy. In chapter 8, we have when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. His firstborn son was Joel, and his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. However, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned toward dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, look, you are old and your sons do not follow your example. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have. We want to be like everybody else. All right? That was what they said at the time. That was their justification of what they were saying. We want to have a king because we want to be just like all the other nations. All right? Now, do they really want to be like all the other nations? What has God said to them over and over and over? Do not be like the other nations. Be distinct. Be separate. I am your God. You have a God that rules over you. They just have a human king, but they're like, no, we want a king to rule over us. The chapter continues, and if you read through it, it says he can take this, 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 and he can take this. And at the end of the day, you're going to rue the day that you wanted a king. And you know what? When you cry out to me, when you want to do away with your king, I'm not listening. All right? That's good parenting, isn't it? God's a good parent. I'll give you what you want. All right? And here's what he's going to do. Are you cool with that? Yeah. Don't come back to me when you don't like this, because I'm not going to listen to you. All right? So that's basically chapter 8. They want a king. Look in verse 19. The people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we must have a king over us. Then we'll be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us, go out before us, and fight our battles. Now, didn't they have somebody who was doing that already? Somebody with a little more power than a human king? Was God not being their judge or giving them judges in their time? What was the problem? What was the problem? Is it that they didn't have judges? God's given them like 12 in his timing. What's the problem with that? How many of us like when God gives us things in his timing and not in ours? What does it force us to do? Wait, trust, believe, suffer, all right? Because God's not going to come in and go, oh, they're going to need something next week. I'm going to go ahead and give it to them now. Anybody your experience of God, you know, this package of $100,000 shows up in your front yard and you're like, gee, I wonder where this came. And a week later, it's like the bill comes and you're like, oh, that was convenient. No, God just doesn't tend to work that way. He wants us to wait. He wants us to be dependent. I always say he's kind of like the opposite of a good parent sometimes, all right? Because he wants dependency. Parents, we should not want dependency from our children. Amen? We want them to be independent. Get out of our house, all right? You know you've done a good job when they go away. Amen? Right, Holland? We have this conversation a lot. All right, so that's kind of the setting of we want this king. We want to be like all the other nations. That's the excuse, right? Any other reason? Do they mention any other reason? No, that's it. We just want to be like everybody else. Just that's the only reason, okay? We roll into chapter 9, and like I said, I am not going to read through all these. I'm going to basically summarize these. So your list that we printed out for you, I hope we had enough. Did we print some more? Did we print some more? Okay. If anybody needs another one, we've got plenty. Sorry, I wasn't sure how many to print. So just go through them line by line. In chapter 9, this guy named Saul is going to be appointed. He's going to be selected. All right? He's an impressive young man. No one was more impressive, and he was a head taller than everybody else. So give me what does this look like? What does it look like that Saul was more impressive than anyone else? And he's about 30 years old. We know he's 30 years old when he becomes king. So what's an impressive 30-year-old look like? What is impressive in this context? What do you think? He was tall, we know that, all right? Handsome? Strong? You think athletic? Because what do they want? We want someone who will judge us, go out before us, and fight our battles, all right? So do you want the big guy, all right? Do you want somebody head taller than everybody else? Do you want somebody impressive? 30-year-old, all right? God didn't go out there and get a 65-year-old, right? He didn't get a 12-year-old, all right? He got a 30-year-old, all right? Very impressive, all this stuff. So get sort of a mental image of what this would look like. An impressive 30-year-old man that's a head taller than everybody else in the entire nation, all right? So that's what we're looking for. Saul, his dad has donkeys. I guess he's raising donkeys. I'm not sure why you raise donkeys. I don't know the value of a donkey other than just to sit here and be a donkey, all right? But the donkeys ran away, okay? And so Saul, he's going to go chase down the donkeys, and eventually God's going to run him into Samuel, okay? So Samuel is there, and God says, hey, by the way, the guy that I'm going to appoint king is going to come looking for his donkeys, so be ready. And so Samuel's there the next day, and he basically takes him up on the rooftop and goes, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to make you king, all right? And this is going to be a good thing, okay? And God's going to do amazing things with you, all right? So we get to chapter 10. Samuel takes the flask of oil, pours it on the head of Saul, kisses him, says, hasn't the Lord anointed you ruler over all of his inheritance? And he's got these missions. I'm going to send you to Rachel's grave, and you're going to find 2 people. I'm going to send you to the Oak of Tabor, and there's going to be 3 people. Then I'm going to send you to this hill of God, and there's a Philistine garrison. And eventually I'm going to send you to Gilgal, and we're going to make you king. Now in 10 verse 6, I want you to see this verse. Like I said, I'm going to fly through Saul, okay? So just strap it in. Do like Spirit Airlines. Get your duct tape out and strap your lawn chair in, all right? 10, 6, and 7 says this: the Spirit of the Lord will control you. You will prophesy with them, and you will be transformed into a different person. When these signs have happened to you, do whatever your circumstances required, because God is with you. Now that's a good setting, right? That's a good foundation right there, isn't it? I'm going to change you into a different person, and the Spirit is going to take control of you. And so when you get into a situation or your circumstances present themselves, do whatever you think is right, because God's going to be with you. Now, is that who Saul turns out to be? Saul's going to train wreck this thing, but he has the potential here. He has the potential to do this thing really, really well. All right? So they go to Mizpah in verse 17. Samuel summoned the people to the Lord at Mizpah. This is they like going to Mizpah. All right? And they said, let's make him king, so let's start presenting. He presents all the different tribes and all the families and all this stuff. And all of a sudden it comes down to, Saul, you're the king. And it's like, where's Saul? Saul's not, where is Saul here? Has anybody seen Saul? in verse 22, they again inquired of the Lord, has the man come here yet? And the Lord replied. This would be an odd moment in time. You're staying there at Mizpah. You've got 2 million, 3 million people sitting around there. Everybody's waiting to see who's the king going to be. And God's going, oh my goodness. So this voice comes, he's hidden in the baggage. Go look over there. He's hiding. What exactly happens to your confidence level as an Israelite when the new king, the 30-year-old who's a head taller than everybody else, this impressive young man, is doing what? I don't want to play. Don't make me go out there. It's like kid going to kindergarten, all right? No, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. What's happening here? This is an impressive young man, a head taller than everybody else. He's 30 years old. He's in the prime of his life. He's been selected to be the king. He's been anointed by Samuel, the judge. And when it comes down time for him to put on the crown, where is he? Hiding in the baggage. What you're going to see in the life of Saul is fear always gets him. Fear always gets him. Every single time. They eventually drag him out. And there, can you believe it? There are some people who are questioned whether or not he should be the king in that moment. Which, how that's not most of them at this point, I don't know. All right? Now, he does have a great moment. Star chapter 11. Okay? Because this is going to be his one moment. Okay? Now, we get this guy named Nahash, the Ammonite. All right? The Ammonites are the guys on the other side of the Jordan River. All right? They came up and laid siege to Jabesh Gilead, and they threatened him, make a treaty with us, and we will serve you. All right? And Nahash says, I'll make one on one condition, that I gouge out everyone's right eye and humiliate all Israel. So all the citizens of Jabesh Gilead, if they sign this treaty, he's going to gouge out their right eye. Now, why do you gouge out somebody's right eye? What's the point? How do you shoot a bow and arrow without a right eye? All right? Think about it. If you're a hunter, if you hunt and somebody take out your shooting eye, all right? This is so they would also do this every now and then. There's a story in the Bible that says they took off people's thumbs, all right? We make fun of Lincoln, our dog, say, well, I would pick up stuff, but I don't have opposable thumbs. Okay, same idea, okay? So there's this thing. They said, let us send out messengers, see if anybody will do this, and if no one comes, we'll just surrender, all right? Because they could have gone ahead and fought it out, but they're like, people are going to die on your side, people are going to die on our side. Let's see if anybody will come help us. If not, we'll surrender, no questions asked. Saul gets the message. Saul rallies the troops. He actually cuts up a team of oxen and sends them all over Israel and says, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't come fight with me. So they go to Jabesh Gilead. They save Jabesh Gilead, and he's the hero of the day. Okay, like I said, star this chapter 11, because that's the only good moment in the life of Saul. 42 years of him being king. This is the one moment. In chapter 12, Samuel is about to die. He's going to walk off the stage, and he is going to take them out with him. He scolds them. He ridicules them. He does everything, but basically says, you're horrible, horrible people. And then in verse 12, chapter 12, verse 12, it says, but when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, was coming against you, you said to me, no, we must have a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God is your king. So why did they want a king in chapter 8? Everybody else has one. We want him to fight our battles and to judge and to rule over us. No. That's not why. And Samuel calls him out on this in chapter 12. And what does he say? You saw Nahash. You knew Nahash was going to start taking out eyeballs. And you didn't want to wait on God to provide the judge, the king, the battle for you. So you said, we want a king. And God gave them exactly what they thought they wanted, didn't they? They needed a warrior to fight against Nahash. And so God said, I'll give you the most impressive man you got, head taller than everybody else. Physically, what was he emotionally? What was he psychologically? Where was he when they tried to anoint or coronate him? Hiding in the baggage. He was always afraid. It's really interesting. It never, at any moment during the life of Saul, does it ever say that he worshiped God in any way, shape, or form. Not a single mention of any time where Saul worshiped God. Now, there was always sort of this polite Sunday school fear of God, but there was never a David-type moment where he worshiped God. And he always had this fear that just controlled his life. Okay? All right. 13. We can hit 13. All right. Now we're going to transition. That was sort of what I call that, the possibility. You can do this. You can be this person. Now he's going to face these tests. In 13, it begins here that Saul was 30 years old when he became king and reigned for 42 years. And then in verse 4 or 3, we get Jonathan. Now who's Jonathan? Jonathan is his son. And who is Jonathan's best friend? David, which is really, really kind of interesting when you start looking at the dates and the times and the years and all this stuff. Because Saul is 30 years old when he becomes king, and he reigns 42 years. In the first sentence into his sort of reign, it mentions Jonathan. Okay? Now, what we know about David, David was born 12 years after Saul became king. Y'all do the math on that one? So Jonathan and David were probably nowhere near each other in age. Y'all with me? You see the math on that? I know we've all kind of grown up with the Vacation Bible School version of Jonathan and David were best of friends and they were just buddies and all this stuff. And I will say this, the numbers and sort of the dates and sort of the chronology of 1 Samuel is really hard to understand, especially with Saul, all right? Because it doesn't say when he was 30 years old, he did this, and when he was 25 years old, he did this. We just don't have that. But we have Jonathan coming out here. Jonathan would have made an awesome king. Jonathan had no fear whatsoever, all right? Jonathan was just that kid that was like, hey, there's some bad guys out there. Let's go fight them, okay? It was just all in all the time. So Jonathan just on his own, verse 13:3, attacks the Philistines, all right? He just attacks them, and he just makes them repulsive, makes the Israelites repulsive in the eyes of the Philistines. And now there's been this arrangement that's been made that Samuel was supposed to meet up with Saul at Gilgal, and they would offer these sacrifices before they went out into the battle, okay? But what happens? Y'all know this story. You've heard this story before. Samuel is delayed. He doesn't show up in time. So Saul does what with the sacrifice? He does it himself, all right? And then, of course, 5 seconds later, who walks up? Samuel walks up, and it's time goes, what are you doing? You're not supposed to do this. I'm supposed to do this. Why did you do this? And he says, because my troops were deserting me. Now, what does that tell you about Saul? My troops were leaving. The Philistines hated us. They didn't like us. and my troops started to desert me, so I went ahead and I did the sacrifice myself. Again, what does it tell you about Saul? Fear. Y'all stay. I'll do the sacrifice. Y'all just stay. Don't run off. Don't leave me by myself. All right? And in verse 13, 13, Samuel said to Saul, you have been foolish. You have not kept the command which the Lord your God gave you. It was, horrible word right there, it was at this time that the Lord would have permanently established your reign over Israel. Whose reign did he permanently establish? David's. All right? I was going to permanently establish your reign at this time. All he had to do was what? Wait for Samuel to show up that day. But again, why did he not? Fear. Distrust. Inability to wait on God to show up. I would have done it. But now your reign will not endure, for the Lord has found a man loyal to him. Some of your translations may say a man after God's own heart. All right? This is where that verse comes from. Now, here's what's really interesting. If this is this early in Saul's reign, how old is David? If he's even born. I mean, he's not going to be born until 12 years into it. All right? You got to understand, David and Goliath, that was 25 years into his reign. So God tells him, I was going to establish your reign forever right now. But now I have a man after my own heart. Very good possibility that David wasn't even born yet at this time. Just really, that's fascinating to me. All right, let's keep moving. In chapter 14, Jonathan again goes out and picks another fight. And the problem is this. Saul has come to them and said, we're going to make an oath that no one's allowed to eat until evening, till the sun goes down. Now, back in these days, if you fast for a day, you'll probably make it. Just FYI, if you actually fasted for a day, you're probably going to be okay. You probably won't pass out or anything. You'll probably be okay. But back in these days, it wasn't like you ate all the time and just had your 3 squares a day and all. So when you took an oath not to eat, this could really hamper you, all right? And Jonathan, in the midst of this going out to the battle, he takes his staff and sticks it in some honey and eats it, all right? Now, the oath was placed on all the people, and the oath was if you did this, you would die. So Saul is now going to have to kill who? His son, Jonathan. And Jonathan, when he finds out about all this, he goes, then kill me. Then kill me. I think it was a dumb oath. He kind of makes that aside. Look how refreshed I am, and you guys are just dragging. You can barely get up right now. This is a dumb oath, but hey, I'll take the consequences. And it says that the people redeemed Jonathan from the hand of Saul. So in the first case, in the first test, what? They were deserting him, and he offers a sacrifice. Now Jonathan, according to this oath, should die. And what does the strong king, the principled king, do in this moment where he should carry out the law and kill his son? And the people convince him to let Jonathan live. What does that tell you? He caves to the people every single time. Look in chapter 15. Saul is told, go kill the Amalekites. I told you I'm flying. Go kill the Amalekites. Completely destroy them. All right? Kill women, men, children, infant, oxen, sheep, camels. Kill their donkeys. If it breathes, kill it. All right? So Saul takes off. He goes out there and he captures the king, completely destroys everybody else, and also spared the best of the cattle, the sheep, choice animals, because he was going to offer them as a sacrifice. Samuel shows up, and he goes, hey, I did what you asked, all right? And it's really interesting because Samuel shows up to find him, to scold him, because God said, hey, Saul didn't do what I told him to do. So he shows up at the place where Saul is supposed to be, and they're like, no, Saul's not here. He's out setting up a monument to himself. So while God is telling Samuel, hey, king screwed up, didn't do what I told him to do, Saul is over here setting up a monument for himself. Out of touch a little bit? What do you think? A little out of touch? Do you see what I'm saying? He has no understanding of God, no relationship with God. All right? It's always sort of this Sunday school kind of distance to him. So Samuel shows up, and it's like, hey, I did what you told me to do. And he goes, then why do I hear sheep? Why do I hear sheep? And it's as if Saul is trying to start this explanation. I'm in verse 14. What is the sound of sheep and cattle that I hear? The troops brought them from the Amalekites and spared the best in order to offer a sacrifice to the Lord your God. But the rest we destroyed. You may have children that try and tell you when they didn't obey, why they didn't obey you. Yes, this is Saul. Okay, so he's doing this. 16, look at the first, what's the first word in 16? What is it? Talk louder. Stop. Anybody have a different word? Enough. What else? Be quiet. How many of you ever quoted Psalm 46:10? Be still and know that the Lord is God. That should be translated, shut up. It's the same exact word right here. When Saul is giving these excuses, Samuel says, stop. Translation, shut up. Quit talking. You're talking. You're doing a lot of this. Zip it. All right? Stop, exclaimed Samuel. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And Saul has the nerve to go, tell me. I would like to know. No, you wouldn't. And he just lays into him. And in this moment, Saul just crumbles. And he says, I have done what is wrong. I feared the people. I feared the people. I feared that the people would do things. And Samuel says, I'm done with you, and God is done with you. He has rejected you. And Saul in this moment reaches out and grabs his cloak and tears a piece of the garment away. And Samuel kind of looks back at him and goes, what you just did to my garment is what God has done with the kingdom. He's torn it away from you. This is it for Saul. For the rest of the time, the whole story is going to be David versus Saul. Okay? So let's jump into 16. Y'all good? Everybody good? Have I lost you at all? Okay. All right, so Samuel anoints David. Samuel has to sneak out of town, go to Bethlehem, shows up, and he anoints David. Obviously, we know the story that goes from there. The Spirit of the Lord, in verse 14, says the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord began to torment him. Now, to remedy that, they do what? Who do they recruit? They recruit David to come and to do what? Play the harp, play the lyre. All right, to ease this torment. And eventually, Saul brings David into his full-time staff. He even sends a letter to Jesse saying, David is going to remain with me. You know why? Because when you have a king, the king can take your son anytime he wants to. And you said that was okay, and I ain't listening to you when you're complaining. Okay? Everybody with me? See how that's going to play out? Okay? God tried to warn him. Okay? Now, this gets really interesting when we start talking through David and Goliath, because when we get David and Goliath, this story, Saul is scared to death. He loses his courage. He is terrified. He runs away just as fast as everybody else when Goliath is out there for 40 days. Now, what has Saul been called on to do? What did they want him to do? To judge and to fight our battles. Now, what's so interesting about Goliath? Why is he such a scary guy? He's tall. And what's so impressive about Saul? He's tall, all right? Does Goliath have armor? Does Goliath have armor? Yes. Does Saul have armor? Yes. Does Saul have armor bearers? Does Goliath have armor bearers? This is pretty much an even fight, all right? Right? But what? He loses his courage. Why? Because every time we see Saul, what's wrong with him? Always afraid. And this is just another story. Now, David is probably 15 years old at the time. I mean, that's sort of a round number that we can throw at it. He was what's called a na'ar, all right? He was a youth, all right? So 15-ish at best, all right? Now, that would probably put Saul in his late 50s, okay? So the age is never really an excuse mentioned in the text here. He's just scared, and he runs off, all right? And David comes in there and wins this battle, okay? 18 begins this idea. We get this parade that takes place, and as they're going through the towns, the girls in town are oohing and ahhing, and ooh, yay, Saul, Saul's so awesome. But Saul has killed his thousands. Oh, but David has killed his tens of thousands. Now, what happens to a person who has power but's always afraid and they get competition? What happens in this? Just pause for a second. Just think through this. Somebody who is impressive but yet always afraid, always runs away, and somebody else comes up and doesn't run away and doesn't give in to the fear and doesn't have all the same inhibitions that you have. That person has two options, right? What's the good option? What could Saul do with David who's at his disposal? And David would even acknowledge, I am at your utter disposal. Whatever you need. What could Saul do with him? This guy's awesome. He even does it. He puts him in charge of his troops. All right? But David just keeps winning more battles. Every time he puts him in charge of something, he wins more battles. And what does this do to Saul's psyche? Jealousy. All right? Jealousy always stems from some problem within you. All right? And this was based on his fear. He was always afraid. And even though he was a head taller than everybody else, this little 15-year-old kid comes out of nowhere and just starts winning battles and doing things that he was too afraid to do. And this jealousy starts to build. In 19, Jonathan actually saves him at one point. And Michal, his wife, saves him at one point. She dresses up a little idol and puts it in the bed and puts like hair on him and stuff. And now Jonathan has turned to favor David, and Michal, the daughter, has turned to favor David. How does this play into that whole dynamic? Is Saul, wow, well, at least my kids really like him, so that's good. No, what happens when your kids really like the person that you hate and you're jealous of? Just makes it even worse. Okay? So David runs the only person he knows to run to, and who is that? Who is he going to run to for counsel, help, anything? He runs to Samuel. He finds Samuel and says, Samuel, you won't believe what's going on. And Samuel kind of goes, I think I do. So, in chapter 20, they have this new moon dinner, sort of a festival, sort of a party thing going on. And this is going to be the test. David knows, hey, he's trying to kill me. He's already thrown his spear at me twice. I'm trying to run away from him. I don't know what to do. So this new moon dinner celebration festival comes along. Gets away from not being there the first night. The second night, Jonathan gets questioned, hey, where's David? And he's like, well, I told him he could do this. And Saul loses it. I think because he wanted to kill him at this point. All right? And Jonathan sees his father for what he really is at this point. And in chapter, 20, verse 34, sorry. I'll start in 33. Then Saul threw his spear at Jonathan to kill him. That should tell you something. So he knew that his father was determined to kill David. He got up from the table in fierce anger and did not eat any food the second day of the new moon. For he was, and watch this verse hit me, probably about 25 years ago, that just scared me to death. For he was grieved because of his father's shameful behavior toward David. As a parent, that verse has haunted me since well before we had Holland. That verse has haunted me, and it should haunt you. That when the son sees and is grieved by the shameful behavior of his father, it's over at that point. It's just over. It's just over. I don't know that you come back from that one. We get the story of Jonathan David shooting arrows, and that was sort of the signal. You need to run. You need to go away. All right. So David leaves at this point, and Saul is still jealous and still bent on getting him. Chapter 21, David flees to the city of Nob. Ahimelech is there, and he gets the food from the table of the presence. He also gets Goliath's sword. Right? One of Saul's men actually sees him. His chief shepherd sees David there, tattles on the Ahimelech. Ahimelech and the entire city of Nob will be slaughtered, just like the Amalekites were supposed to be. Saul actually does that to the city of priests there at Nob. Then David flees to Gath, goes to King Achish at Gath, which is really interesting because Goliath was from Gath. So David runs to the city of Goliath and kind of appeals for sort of some type of protection. And when he doesn't feel like he's going to get it, what does he do? What does David do? Anybody know? He acts like he's crazy. Starts drooling all over the place, scratching on the walls, just. And King Achish says, "Do I really need any more crazy people in my town?" It's a good funny line. David eventually in 22 makes his way to Moab, which is where God says, get back in bounds. You can't run out of bounds. You got to get back in the fight. You got to get back in there. And this is when Saul starts chasing very deliberately, sending out his forces. His mission is to kill David. And he uses his armed forces to kill David. So he chases him all over the place. In chapter 23, David saves the city of Keilah, if you want to call it that. And in 23:14, y'all catch me there? 23:14 says, Saul searched for him every day, but God did not hand David over to him. God was continually protecting him, which, in my opinion, I think a lot of the Psalms were written in this period of David's life. You with me? Because what do we see in the Psalms? God, why are you sending me? Why are they so oppressing me? Why are they chasing me? Why? But you are my refuge. You are my stronghold. You are my strength. You are my protection. You are this. So that sort of schizophrenic nature of David, I think, comes from this period in his life. In chapter 24, we get the story of the cave. All right, David and his men are hiding in the cave. 400 men are in the back of a cave. And Saul comes in to, quote unquote, relieve himself. We don't know if that means going to the restroom or taking a nap. I would lean more towards taking a nap because David does what? Cuts off a corner of his robe. All right? And then Saul plays sort of this schizophrenic thing. Oh, I'm sorry, David. I'll never do this to you again. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that to you. Chapter 25, it's kind of a story we'll talk about next week. It's more of just David. In chapter 26, we get a very similar episode in the wilderness of Ziph. Saul is camped out looking for David, trying to kill him, and he's sleeping in the middle of the inner circle. So all of his troops are around him, and Saul is sleeping in the middle, and David and his, I forget the guy's name now. Sorry, I lost his name. His armor bearer walk in the middle and steal the pitcher and the spear that are right next to Saul's head. So he could have killed him very easily. So we get this whole thing. And look in 26:25. In In 26:25, it says, Saul said, "You are blessed, my son David. You will certainly do great things and will also prevail." Then David went his own way, and Saul returned home. So we get kind of this, I'm not going to chase you anymore. Every time I chase you, you get away. It's just, I know I'm doing wrong, but I'm angry, I'm jealous, I'm mad, I'm afraid. I'm all these things that I shouldn't be. And that's why I said you get this sort of schizophrenic nature where Saul is always kind of apologetic, and you see the language of him humbling himself, but he never does it toward God. It's always, I feel bad about what I have done. I don't ever feel remorse for who I have offended in the person of God. So you never, ever see a relationship between Saul and God, all right? Which I think, and again, it still haunts me when I read that verse, at this time I was going to establish your reign forever. That God didn't kind of throw him out there as, you're the one that's going to fail so I can bring in David. No, you were the one that I chose, but you did fail over and over and over again because you never had a relationship with me like David did. And that made all the difference in the world for him. 27, we'll look at this next week. I hate 27:1. And like I said, we'll look at this more next week. But David says to himself, one of these days I will be swept away by Saul. And he quits, and he goes to live with the Philistines. I think this is, besides Bathsheba, this is the other tragic moment for me in the life of David. Because he just says, God can't protect me forever. Eventually, Saul's going to catch up with me. Which is kind of funny because one of the stories, I skipped over it. It's in chapter 23. They're playing Ring Around the Mountain. And so you have David and his guys are running around the mountain one way, and Saul's and his guys are running around like this. And eventually a messenger comes and says, Saul, the Philistines are coming. He goes, oh, okay, I'll break away. So he's saved at that point. But it's almost as if David just says, God can't protect me forever. And like I said, besides Bathsheba, I think this is the lowest moment in the life of David right here in 27. But like I said, we'll get to that next week. So David goes to live with the Philistines, literally with the Philistines. In 28, the Philistines are coming up against Saul. I'm going to read this because I've got time now. At that time, the Philistines brought their military units together into one army to fight against Israel. So Achish, the guy David had gone to, said to David, you know, of course, that you and your men must march out in the army with me. And David replied to Achish, good, you will find out what your servants can do. So Achish said to David, very well, I will appoint you as my permanent bodyguard. And by this time, Samuel had died. So is Samuel dead? That was an easy question. Sorry, that wasn't a trick question at all. So y'all are all sitting there going, I don't know. What do you mean by that? I don't know. No, when it says Samuel had died, Samuel was dead. Okay, everybody with me? I just want to make sure we're clear on this because it's going to get really interesting here in just a second. Okay? And all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah. All right? And Saul had removed the mediums and spiritists from the land. Now the Philistines came together and camped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel, and they camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine camp, he was what? Afraid again and trembled violently. Imagine the biggest man in your whole camp trembling violently. It inspires great courage, right? Here's your king. Where's the king? He's over there in the corner in a fetal position. 6, he inquired of the Lord. Okay? Saul inquires of the Lord. Okay? Does that mean there's a relationship? You ever heard anybody pray? God, you got to get me out of this ticket. God, make that police officer not come after me. God, fix this. Okay? That's not a relationship. Okay? That's just not. So Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him in dreams or by the Urim or by the prophets. Saul then said to his servants, find me a woman who is a medium so I can go and consult her. Now, is that his only recourse? No. What's the recourse? humbly repent. Right? And what does God say he will do? We just talked about this Sunday. Return to the Lord with all your heart, with weeping and fasting and mourning. Why? Because he is what? Gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, rich in faithful love, and relents from sending disaster. I don't even think Saul knows that path, much less being willing to do it. Because immediately when God doesn't answer, he goes what? Go find me the witch at Endor. All right, if you ever wondered where that came from, it's right here in the text. So he goes to this woman, and in verse 11, who is it you want me to bring up for you, the woman asked. Bring up Samuel for me, he answered. When the woman saw Samuel. Now, why is that weird? Because he's dead and buried, all right? She screamed appropriately, and then she asked Saul, why did you deceive me? You are Saul. But the king said to her, don't be afraid. What do you see? I see a spirit coming up out of the earth, the woman answered. Then Saul asked her, what does he look like? An old man is coming up, she answered. He's wearing a robe. Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and paid homage. 15, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Samuel asked Saul. Now, if you're not a little wigged out by this passage in Scripture, you're just not paying attention. Because dead people don't generally come back from the dead and don't respond to a medium, a spiritist, calling them out, and especially not to go see somebody who's ungodly as Saul. Okay, so this is just weird on about 12 different levels. I don't know, of all the questions I'm asked, this one generally comes up if people want to ask me weird Bible questions. Was it really Samuel? And I say, I don't know, but Saul talked to him like he's Samuel, and Samuel talked to Saul like he was Samuel. So I don't know what you do with this, but all I know is he said, why'd you disturb me by bringing me up? And so he ain't happy. I'm in serious trouble, replied Saul. You don't know the half of it, all right? The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He doesn't answer me anymore, either through the prophets or in dreams. So I've called on you to tell me what I should do. Samuel answered, okay, with a very godly answer. Since the Lord has turned away from you, has become your enemy, why are you asking me? The Lord has done exactly what he said through me. The Lord has torn the kingship out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. You did not obey the Lord, and you did not carry out his burning anger against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will also hand Israel over to the Philistines along with you. Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me. And the Lord will hand Israel's army over to the Philistines. Immediately, Saul fell flat on the ground and was terrified by Samuel's words. For the very first time, he is appropriately afraid. All right? This is not a moment for courage, right? All right? And he was also weak because he hadn't eaten any food, and eventually he ends up eating. Chapter 29 is the story of 29 and 30. Goes back to sort of just David. So jump to 31. In chapter 31, we get sort of the end of the story of Saul. The Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel's men fled from them. Many were killed on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons and killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchua. When the battle intensified against Saul, the archers caught up with him and severely wounded him. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and run me through with it, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and torture me. But his armor-bearer would not do it because he was terrified. Then Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his own sword and died with him. So on that day, Saul died together with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men. Now, the Philistines are going to catch him. They're going to cut off his head, and they're going to take his body, and they're going to hang it up on the wall as a demonstration of this is what happens to people who fight against us. And again, what was his one moment of glory? What was the one moment of glory for Saul? When he fought for what city? It's chapter 11, you remember? Jabesh Gilead. The men of Jabesh Gilead come and rescue the body of Saul and his sons, take it back, burn it, bury his bones appropriately, as should be done. So he had that one moment of glory in his kingdom. But the rest of the time, it was marked by fear, paranoia, jealousy, rage. Basically, everything that goes against what the Spirit of God, the fruit of the Spirit in our own lives would be. Because simply this, he had no relationship with this God. None. Not once in all those 23 chapters do we see any type of relationship with God or an understanding of God or humility towards God. All right? How we do? I'm barely over time, even with Randall taking up all my time with the business meeting. So, any questions? Any thoughts? Y'all like the Samuel coming back from the dead thing? That'll scare you. Yeah, Randall. You need the microphone? When I'm through. All right. Any questions about Saul? I hope you see, here's what I always hate doing Bible studies on negative characters or characters that are just bad because it's hard to get any good lessons and motivational application out of this. I would simply say this: understand what he was and see if there's any remnants of his character in your own life. Is there jealousy? Is there rage? Is there fear? Do you trust God? Are you afraid of people? Do they influence you more than the right thing to do? What do you do when someone is stronger than you and braver than you and more courageous than you? Do you tend to try and knock them down and chase them down? Think about all the collateral damage that took place in the life of Saul because of his jealousy. Think about the city of Nob, completely destroyed. All the priests of the city, completely destroyed. Using your family members, tried to kill his son, tried to use his daughters as bait for the Philistines to kill off David. Just a train wreck of everything because there was no relationship, there was no understanding of God in that. So, all right, let me pray for us, and then Randall's got 30 seconds, and we're going to time you. So, Father, thank you for just giving us this time tonight to come. I thank you for these disciples that have come here seeking to know more about your word, to know more of what you see, what you look for, what we as humans can devolve into. Father, I pray that you would bless them for the time that they have spent here being good students of your word. I pray that you just continue to walk with us through this series and all of the kings, that we would see amazing things, scary things, haunting things, glorious things in these men that had all this power thrust upon them. So, Father, keep our eyes and ears open. May we see beautiful things in your word as you reveal them to us. And again, I thank you for each person, each disciple that you brought out here tonight. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.